Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Dave. You're the audience. Thank you very much for joining us on the third Thursday lecture series from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. This is going to be pretty awesome. I'm not pulling any punches there. Craig Williams is the president of the board of directors for the Canal Society of New York State. He retired in 2014 as a senior historian at the New York State Museum after more than 30 years of service. From 1978 to 1983, he was the director of the DeWitt Historical Society of Tompkins County in Ithaca. And from 1976 to 1977, he was the curator at the Erie Canal Museum. As one of the leading Erie Canal scholars, we are extremely appreciative of his work to preserve the rich history of the canal system and his years of dedication to sharing the relevancy that historic system still holds for all of us today. A man whose own digressions and tangents still hold more historical value than any popular cable channel's programming. We gratefully welcome Craig Williams.
Thanks, David. I hope you can all hear me. I have to say I was embarrassed. I couldn't get on to WebEx up until about 5 minutes before, so I was a little frazzled with that. But calmed by this map. This is a favorite of mine, and especially appropriate for St. Patrick's Day. This was done in 1857 by David Vaughan. He was an Irish immigrant, so St. Patrick's Day, came to Albany in the late 1840s and was immediately latched on by the Canal Department to do drafting work. And I could do a whole program just on David Vaughan. Some of you have suffered through that already, so I won't go through all of that. But I'm using the map also as an illustration just to go over some basics that most of you probably know, that there are 3 Erie canals. This map is to show the enlarged Erie Canal. What I'm going to be talking this Erie Canal, what I'm going to call the Clinton's Ditch. And then we have the 3rd Erie Canal, the Erie Barge Canal. When David talked about going over to Lock 12, that's that canal. So it'd be great if David Vaughan could tell you all this, but you're stuck with me right now. So one of the things that David can't seem to get the thing to go.
It can be finicky once in a while.
Help, David.
If you have the menu at the top, looks like it's open a little bit. I believe you already tried clicking off to the side, and you should be able to use your arrow key to advance after that. The technology is great when it works smooth, and I'm sure at this point we've all kind of experienced in the last couple of years that moment where sometimes it doesn't work quite so smooth, even though it's worked exactly the same for you every other time. I've encountered that a few times here on WebEx because there's an update.
David, is there a way you can take control?
I can, yeah, if you, without having those menus in the way, I will take over the control. You'll just have to let me know when to advance your slide for you.
Okay.
And you'd like me to advance to the next one?
Yes. Anytime now. Oh, there you go. Okay, thanks. So besides his great skill in doing maps, David Vaughan was also especially famous for the little cartouches that he would put in on maps. Some of them kind of, well, you know, I'd never get away with it today as a state bureaucrat. So this one, for instance, is actually on a legislative document from 1854. And he's making a comment that everybody would see in the state legislature at a time when nativism was especially prominent. So you see an Irishman there on the scales to the right and the Native American falling off on the left. So he's definitely making a statement there. Okay, David, next slide. And immigrants have always been, like David Bond, have always been part of the story. So here with the barge canal in the early 20th century is a sign. It's in the State Museum's collection, probably around 1910, advertising for work, but advertising in Italian. So next slide, David. And as we will experience, the Irish were very prominent in most of the generations of the canal. In the barge canal, many came from Italy. So this is a census record from Fort Miller, New York for 1905. And they captured a labor camp. And very prominently, you can see all from Italy and all working on the barge canal. So next slide, David. Probably doing work like this. And work like this was probably laying riprap from day one was important on the canal. So, so why are immigrants so much a part of the story? The canal has always created portals to society at many levels. You might call them opportunities for, I dare say, these guys who have spent the day with back-breaking work laying heavy stone. They may not consider the work an opportunity, but nonetheless, it did give them connections to American society or American societies. So David, next slide. Pushing the point even further, the canal touched the lives of many, many more than almost any other social or technological activity in New York State in the 19th century. I'd be hard pressed to even think of somebody in the 1820s or 30s who didn't have some connection to the canal, either using it or, if you will, being used by it, providing services or resources, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. I'll just say the Haudenosaunee didn't do so well. Here we have receipts from Canvas White, who's one of the premier surveyors for that first Erie Canal. And he's making a payment for washing his clothes. He's out in the field, and he's hired Hilda Bailey in Pittsburgh, New York, and Elizabeth Stark down in Junius near the Finger Lakes to do his laundry. So in a sense, these receipts and this activity reflect life along the canal. Mark Twain used that mirror image a lot in regards to the Mississippi. I would dare say that the canal is even more so. To build the canal and keep it running, they needed, especially in these early years, a full cross-section of society. At the time, the refrain was the canal was built and maintained by the people of the state of New York, not the state of New York, but the people of the state of New York. And they took that very seriously. These records, the canal, gives us an opportunity to reach down into the lives of these diverse people, diverse individuals, would normally be below the radar of most historians. Oh, it worked that time. So here's another even a great example. This is a receipt from May 1828, up on the Champlain Canal, actually, for work done. In this case, the person who did the work, Mintus Northup, couldn't sign his name, so he just did his mark. This should sound familiar. Well, I'll just say another person who is likely helping him is his son, Solomon. Solomon Northup, in his 12 years a slave, actually refers to working on the Champlain Canal and refers to working for the section superintendent, who's in the bottom left down there, Van Nortwick. So we can see, indeed, there's confirmation of his work on the Champlain Canal. Interestingly, and gratefully so, the rate of pay was the same as everybody else. So I think my attempt at a profound theme would be that this type of diversity is what has made the canal successful and should continue to do so. Now I'm going to get to the boring stuff. Great example. Most of the talk is going to be dealing with what I know as Series A1125 at the New York State Archives. Sounds appealing. So there's about 10 boxes like this. The original manuscripts from building and getting the canal going from the very first days up until about 1826. Many of the bundles have not been unwrapped since the 1830s. And admire the red twill tape. And you've probably heard the cliche for bureaucracy about being tied up in red tape. That's where it comes from. And it is especially appropriate to study these records. They cover basically 3 types of categories, though they're all mixed up. The collection is not very well organized. My construct for the collection is to put it in terms of planning and surveying, construction, and operation and maintenance. So we're going to cover each of those topics, beginning with planning and surveying. And it's appropriate that we do that. We're in the middle of the bicentennial period for the Erie Canal. I certainly remember 1967 and the great events that went on for that. I wasn't around for the Wedding of the Waters in 1825, but I hear that was a pretty grand affair too. I shouldn't say this, so don't anybody say that I said this. I gotta say I'm a little disappointed that we aren't doing more to mark that event. Indeed, let's see. It was with great pride that they announced the start of the canal. Here's a newspaper article from later in July announcing the July 4th, 1817 first digging for the canal, which took place in Rome. You see where the star is? That's the Worthington Industries plant in Rome on the west side of Rome. It now covers that first Erie Canal. If you look toward the bottom of the building, you'll see a row of trees heading down to, say, 4 o'clock. That line of trees is actually on the towpath of that first Erie Canal. So, in 1967, there was great fanfare for that anniversary. Right there. I have to admit, because I'm kind of geeky when it comes to canal stuff, I went there on July 4th, 2017, and I sat in the parking lot there just on the corner of the building, and I didn't see anybody else, which I'm not sure how to take that. Just to get your bearings. So there's the Worthington Industries relative to the rest of the city of Rome. You can see Fort Stanwix just above center, and the barge canal cutting across the bottom. Another reason why, at least I am going through these records, is to identify canal sites and provide greater documentation for them. So here I've done an overlay of the canal, the various canal routes in Rome. Remember, Rome also had the canal from the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company. The first Erie Canal actually bypassed the village. Then the enlarged Erie went back in, and then the barge bypassed it again. And I saw Steve Talbot and the participants there. Steve is doing a remarkable job in overlaying this information, and I'm hoping we can get that out to the public real soon. So thanks, Steve, for all that. Okay, so planning and surveying. Yeah, no surprise. He's probably looking at me right now going, it's about time you got to me. DeWitt Clinton, certainly the inspiration for the canal. And he worked, to be fair, he worked very hard on it. Indeed, his involvement with the canal goes back even before that 1817 first digging, though he wasn't actually there. There are receipts from DeWitt Clinton in the A1125 because, he incurred expenses. Here he is testifying to the submission of, nearly $2,000 of personal expenses, along with some of the other acting commissioners, acting canal commissioners. By acting, they mean the commissioners that were actually doing work, not that they were temporary. They're the formal people who are out in the field doing the work. I mentioned that Clinton actually was involved earlier. One of the famous examples of that is the exploratory trip that he took with several other commissioners in 1810 to just scout out a possible route from Schenectady to Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. And the receipts for that trip are in a 1125. They're actually quite voluminous. I picked this one because I bet that he could appreciate just what it took to go across the frontier in 1810. So just to read a couple of it, it begins with 20 gallons of Madeira wine, 15 gallons of port wine, 10 gallons of brandy. I could go on, but I think you get the gist of that. It was a tough job and needed some help. Another person who also worked for the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company and was premier with that first generation of Erie Canal engineers was Benjamin Wright of Rome, New York. So in 1817, he would have been 47 years old, already had a long career in working with this type of material. He also was one of the first surveyors when the state was planning the canal. So here's his survey book, which is in the Oneida County Historical Society from 1812. He's out surveying the route near Chittenango, New York. You can see he's making a mark on the large pine tree. I bet it's not there anymore. When he gets more involved as the canal actually gets close to being started, he's making more aggressive efforts with others to really lay down the line for the canal. So here he is buying surveying equipment for early 1817 as he's trying to mark out the section between Rome and the Seneca River, that middle division, which was the first kind of target for canal construction. But you needed other things besides, a compass or a leveling rod or a transit. You needed food. So indeed, here's a receipt, a voucher that Benjamin Wright issued to Ephraim Durling to serve as cook for the team of surveyors as they're going from Rome to the Seneca River. So again, it's not the type of person that Ephraim, I'm not slighting him, but not the type of person that usually rises to the level of the county histories. So it'd be great to know more about him. Canvas White is another of that kind of first generation engineers. And here he is getting paid by James Geddes, who was a colleague of Benjamin Wright from the Syracuse area. And Canvas White is being paid for surveying also in May of 1817. The type of detail that really helps kind of create a very vivid picture of how that canal got started. After they complete the middle section of the canal, work goes east and west. As part of that, Canvas White was sent out toward the Rochester area to survey the route of the canal. He seems to be washing his clothes an awful lot. So here he is paying D. Field Jr. in Phelps, New York for washing 72 pieces of clothing. Now I could turn the camera over to my closet here, and I don't have 72 pieces of clothing, but a side note on that, the person who probably actually did the laundry in D. Field's tavern here was an African-American woman who was living in the house. Canvas White sounds like a fun guy, saying that with a smile. Why chocolate and the sugar was essential for surveying work, I don't really know. I know when I put in as a state worker for, Snicker bars, they never approved that. So times have changed. Doubly so with Canvas White purchasing I guess out near Rochester, rum, gin, brandy, and wine. Almost covered all the bases there except for beer. Um, and the state reimburses him for that. No doubt he's also sharing it with the surveying crew, I'm sure. Okay, dealing with construction. Again, these are, at first glance, really tedious documents. That handwriting, by the way, is by Myron Holly, who I'll talk about in just a moment. The usual packet is the handwritten contract. One would go to the contractor, one would stay with the state, usually a couple pages long. And Myron Holly would write out each one of them with meticulous handwriting. Very grateful for that. Then there'd be receipts for his advance payments to the contractors. The state would upfront money for the work because in upstate New York in 1817, 1820, there wasn't a lot of free cash floating around. And then there'd be a final accounting of the work done. So maybe altogether 6, 7 pieces of paper. I bet for a contract today, I bet it would be more. Here's the final estimate for a contract for Lock 52. Now, my immediate reaction to Lock 52 is that's Fort Byron Lock 52. This is not that lock. Lock 52 is actually Lock 1 in Albany. They numbered the locks at this time from Utica to the east. So Lock 1 on that first Erie Canal was near Frankfort, New York, and then it numbered to the east. So the last lock on the Hudson was Lock 52. And this is done in 1823. It's the little details in these things that you can comb out that shed light on some of the developments at the time. So here, Peter Stewart is being paid extra for, as it says here, procuring lime by being directed to obtain it from Madison County instead of the northern lime. And that's actually pretty significant because what it reflects is that we've discovered hydraulic cement near Chittenango and a huge difference in canal construction. And the canal commissioners are asking him to buy it there. Traditionally, if you go out to Rome, New York right now, I think there's still a historic marker near where the canal village used to be that says, the first digging was right there. Actually, it wasn't, but it gives credit for that was the first section to be worked on. And that's what the folklore has always been. And indeed, this is the contract for that to John Richardson, who was actually a fairly prominent contractor there at the time, also worked on the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company Canal. The problem is that his contract is dated July 12th, 1817. So it's well after July 4th, not by much, but certainly after. Because this has traditionally been marked as, the number 1, the first, section 1. It's actually gotten special treatment at the archives. It's in its own special folder. So that's a usual contract, 3 pages long. Also all done by hand by Myron Holly, signed by John Richardson and Myron Holly. And then there'd be a final accounting of his contract by Benjamin Wright. In this case, being done by the end of 1819. That middle section had boats working on it by the end of 1819. Okay, so that's pretty good. John Richardson should get credit for doing great work, but he wasn't the first, at least according to what we find in A1125. To access those records, there is an account book that lists at least those early contracts. And indeed, here's the citation for John Seymour. John Seymour had the section right next to John Richardson. And you can see his first payment by Myron Holly, his first advance payment was June of 1817. So his is actually the first contract. maybe we historically have forgotten about John Seymour, though he was a prominent local family, because he failed. Many of those first contractors on that section around Utica, Rome, and to the west, many of them failed. And John Seymour, likely the first contractor, did fail. In fact, you can see the date on this 1834. One of the subcontractors working for John Seymour, and that would be the norm. The Seymour would take the whole contract and then he'd divvy it up to smaller entities. So this is, 15 years later, one of the subcontractors is appealing to the state to get paid for the work he did for John Seymour's defaulted contract. Someday I'll have to figure out if he actually did get reimbursed. Okay, so Myron Holly. I greatly admire Myron Holly. He would go up and down the route of the canal, advancing funds, keeping count, keeping track of the expenses, working with all of the contractors and laborers in this early period, 1817 to 1819, 1820. There's a great quote about him. I'm just going to read it here. This gentleman is distinguished for his extensive research and acute discrimination. He has devoted his whole time and attention, mind and body, to the canal, and some of his most luminous reports and communications have proceeded from his pen. His mild and conciliatory manners, his elevated character, his spotless integrity, and his business talents have rendered his services as an acting canal commissioner invaluable. And that's what DeWitt Clinton wrote about Myron Holly. So again, he would go up and down the route of the canal, inspect the work that was done, and then advance money to the contractor so that the contractor could continue to pay the laborers, buy supplies. So again, the state upfronted the money. Here are receipts that he's made to Joshua Hathaway of Rome. Hathaway was also one of the go-to contractors, very successful at the time. You can quickly develop this image of Myron Holly going up and down between Rome and DeWitt and Port Byron in his buggy with a big chest of coin. That was impossible. It would be incredibly heavy. What he's doing is paying in paper money, script. And then these contractors would deposit that and use that to pay laborers. Trying to keep up with that could be a problem. Again, the contractors were willing to work hard, but they really pushed the envelope. So one of the contractors near Rome, New York in 1818 is writing Myron Holly. Again, this is in the A1125. Sir, I am sorry to trouble you, but I am in need of some money. I'm entirely destitute and expect to be sued every day. This is the contractor. The people whom I have been dealing with are poor, and I being a stranger makes it worse. I've done a good deal of work since I saw you last. Please send money. Myron Holly did, post haste. So Joshua Hathaway, I mentioned him a moment ago. His grave in Rome, New York, again, a prominent figure in those early years of the canal. There's a whole second tier of people in those early years. We think of Benjamin Wright and James Geddes and those kind of top echelon guys, but then there's the guys who actually do the work, if you will. So there's Luke Hitchcock, probably a stonemason, works on the Clinton's Ditch, takes several contracts, actually takes contracts on the enlarged canal, and no doubt was very proud of his work. So this is his tombstone. It's not over his grave. I don't actually know where he's buried now. This grave marker is on the front lawn of the Madison County Historical Society, but you can see, and it was likely him carving the sculpture of an aqueduct. He was certainly proud of his work. Erie Doolittle is another person, also probably dealing with stone. He had been in the area for a number of years. He was actually the superintendent of the Brotherton Indians, so-called at the time. Um, for our for the Canal Society's park out in Port Byron, we know Erie Doolittle because the Clinton's ditch lock at Port Byron was called Doolittle's Lock due to his work there. So doing a lot of stuff, building aqueducts, building locks, dealing with stone. So here's one of his receipts, one of his expense accounts, if you will, to the state to get payment for his services, for his travel expenses. You know, the ones I did for the state when I worked for the state didn't look too dissimilar from this, though mine tended to be more cryptic. You can see from Auburn to Onondaga, he spends a lot of time in Auburn. Yes, there's certainly good stone quarries in the Auburn area. We forget that one of the blessings for the Erie Canal in that early time is that we had good building stone, limestone. There were other quarries he could have gone to. This is 1818. And I'm curious, the other big user of the quarries in Auburn in that year and the year before was the new Auburn prison. And I'm speculating that there might be a connection there. Indeed, just recently we came across the contract, if you will, for the Rochester Aqueduct over the Genesee River. And the initial work for that was actually done by inmates from Auburn Prison. They went up to Rochester to press the stone and build the aqueduct until local laborers certainly objected to having prison labor take their job. So that didn't work out so well. So there is this precedent of the state using prison labor to do some work on the canal. And I'm curious whether this might be a reflection of that. Okay, so we've talked about the different tiers of people building the canal, you know, Benjamin Wright, and then Erie Doolittle. Now we're getting to the people who actually do the shovel and pick. This is a neat drawing that I found in one of the canal field books. It was on the inside flap cover, done by the Surveyor. And it's actually from about 1854, but what it shows would not be unlike what you would have seen in 1818. Kind of a neat drawing. The canal commissioners were really interested on just how work was progressing, especially in those early, first year or two. And they make the remark that I can see them standing there with a stopwatch, not really, but they make the statement that 3 Irishmen, okay, why they pick Irishmen? This is 1817. 3 Irishmen finished, including banks and towing path, 3 rods of the canal. So that would be 50 feet in 4 feet cutting. So the canal was 4 feet deep in the space of 5.5 days. They were very proud of that. That doesn't seem like a lot to me. 50 feet when you had 363 miles to go, often through much, much worse places. So section 24 is near Kirkville, New York, near Poolsbrook. And the contractor there has sublet work to others. And it gives you a sense of, at least in these early years, 1817, 1818, if you had walked west from Rome along the route of the canal, you would have seen people working. Indeed, and they make the statement that in 1818, you would have seen between Rome and the Seneca River, 2,000 laborers working, which stretched over that kind of 60 miles isn't so much. That changes. But here you have an idea of just this little section of 30 men employed. When I say it changed, it changes when it gets to the really difficult work. particularly here at Lockport, this classic scene of, yes, Irish laborers um, carving out the canal through very difficult stone. Um, and in this illustration, the workers seem like little ants. A very dramatic image. Now, I'm going to show you this one. Steve Boner, who is another Canal Society member, is doing great work in these kind of three-dimensional drawings of work along the canal. So with great research, he has reconstructed what it must have looked like carving out that deep cut west of Lockport with the cranes and the laborers, and they basically had to chisel the channel out of the canal. The smoke you see, and this comes across in the descriptions, they were constantly blasting rock, and that if you were in Lockport or what becomes Lockport, the huts around there, you would have just constantly seen kind of a haze in the sky from this blasting. In fact, though it's actually from a few years later, this description of the work at Lockport is probably appropriate. It was done by when Lafayette came through. But to keep that level, there are miles of deep, dark cutting through hard blue limestone where tons of gunpowder were burnt, and the Irish laborers grew so reckless of life that at the signal for blasting, instead of running to the shelter provided for them, they would just hold their shovels over their heads to keep off the shower of small stones and be crushed every now and then by a big one. David, could you advance that? It's stuck up again. Okay. So yeah, Steve Boner's website. Definitely recommend it. He has some great illustrations of the Clinton's Ditch, and I know he's working on others. Just reading his blog posts, fascinating. Okay, as long as we're in Lockport, the work there was so difficult that the state there, more than elsewhere in the state, actually takes control of some of the work and starts to pay laborers almost directly. So there are quite a few good records of the laborers there and then. This is one packet of vouchers to laborers, and I think you can quickly see on the list the Irish names, and not only Irish names, but the attempt of the contractor or the state worker to kind of phonetically write down the name. So you see like what must be O'Neill, but it's Onail. O'Brien is Obrion. So they're trying to get it, but the names are different. They're unfamiliar to these guys. They're trying to do the best, but you can see traditionally Irish names, O'Connor, so on and so forth. If you really want to know more, and I highly recommend this too, Patrick McGreevy's book, Stairway to Empire, is a wonderful resource in describing the relationship between the Irish and the other immigrants in Lockport. Remember, in 1824, 1825, everybody in Lockport was an immigrant. So certainly the Irish tended to keep together. There were riots, strikes, other affairs I won't go into. But again, highly recommend Patrick's book. Just digging the channel was not enough. So they do have other structures that they need to build, bridges. So for instance, here's a receipt from Timothy Jervis, John Jervis's brother, John being another one of the premier surveyors at the time, for building a bridge near his house at the junction of the old and new canal in Rome. The old canal being the canal of the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company. Remember, Rome was one of the few places, Schenectady being the other, where when the famous wedding of the waters came through in 1825, Rome actually protested the completion of the canal because the canal had bypassed the village. Just some other quick examples of additional work. Pliny Darrow, who seems to be quite a skilled craftsperson because, at least in the Rome, Durhamville, Utica area, he's building a lot of stuff for the canal to get it open. So 1825, this building a towpath bridge, building wheelbarrows. He's also building one of the first toll houses. Remember, the state pays for the canal by charging a toll on the freight hauled, and you would have these toll stations along the length of the canal. So here, 1820, soon after the canal is completed in that area, the contract gives a fairly good description of what this building looked like. Similarly, Aaron Burt would be kind of the Pliny Darrow of Syracuse, and the go-to person to build things for the state there. He was a contractor. Here he's building the first Syracuse Waylock, not where the Waylock building is today, just north of there. Quite a substantial sum, and building the bridge to connect it to the towpath. I know this might sound tedious going through all these receipts, but again, they're pieces of a giant puzzle, and they, as I said at the start, they create a much better sense of what it was like for the state doing this public works. Remember, outside of the military, nobody had really done this before. So they were really kind of feeling their own way. Okay, operation and maintenance, again, something they had never really done before, but they were very rigorous about keeping accounts, even then. So here is the payroll register by Roderick Matson. He was the section superintendent in Port Byron. Indeed, he's the person who actually names Port Byron Port Byron. It was called Bucksville before that. He names it Port Byron in recognition of Lord Byron. So here you have this little frontier community identifying now with a freedom fighter. Lord Byron had just died fighting for Greek independence. So very meticulously keeping track of who's working, lock tenders. Curiously, the foreman for Roderick Matson's crew is Nathaniel Matson. I suspect he's either a brother, more likely a son. Keep it in the family. One of Roderick Matson's vouchers for, and it looks for all the world like they're getting fluffing and buffing the canal to get ready for the October wedding of the water. So they're painting the bridges and the lock houses. And the painter is Brigham Young, who goes on to do other things as a leader of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Both Brigham Young and Roderick Matson, David mentioned this, I get off topic. Both of them soon leave the area. Obviously, Brigham Young goes on with the Mormons. Roderick Matson goes to Missouri, where he's recognized for his skill. He's also recognized as being the largest slave owner in Missouri. Indeed, he may have owned slaves in Port Byron. His skill is recognized such that he becomes the captain of the militia out in that area. So the first action they do out there is what's called the Mormon Wars. So at that time period, it would have been Roderick Matson leading the local residents against Brigham Young's forces. And they certainly knew each other, and they would have known each other on the other side. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. So keeping it in the family, here's a receipt by Philip Barry for his services, but also for his son, Bacchus, and for his son, Alan. Hopefully he shared the money with the sons. Okay, so in looking at these receipts, you really have to dig deep for clues and put pieces together. So here are two vouchers receipts by Charles Whippo. He was the section superintendent out in the Medina area. And on the top one from March 1825, it's by Jacob Freeman. Obviously, he can't sign his name. He just puts his mark. And it's for 37.5 cents for one full day of work on the canal. Okay, the one below, which is almost the same day, is 37.5 cents for a half a day of work to Ephraim Cook. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's the fact that Freeman might be a freed slave. The Freeman name in that area at that time period, many of them are African American. Is this reflective of something? Discrimination? Be interesting to know more. Oh, it's back up. So besides actual labor, you also needed to buy supplies. So Lansing, you see his name at the top. He was the section superintendent in Little Falls, New York, and he's buying supplies from William Girvin, and it looks pretty matter of fact, though there's the statement that these are being used to work on the old locks at Little Falls. Little Falls, like Rome, had a stretch of canal from the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company. So here's an indication that they're still using that. There's also the reference to one lock for the collector's office in Little Falls. But again, if you dig deep, if you kind of look beyond the writing here, there's a couple things of interesting. So William Girvin, who must have been a merchant in the village, actually had slaves. So when Lansing goes to his store, he no doubt would have been in the presence of a number of African American slaves. Lansing, in his own household, had several African Americans, so they're listed as free for whatever that meant at that time. So again, a very strong African American presence at that time here in Little Falls. Okay, from that serious note, here's a voucher to Seth Tubbs, T-U-B-S, and it's one of the first indications of building boats on the canal. It's always amazed me that almost like mushrooms, canal crafts sprout on the waterway. Yeah, there were boat builders around on the lakes and things like that, but within a matter of months, hundreds of boats were on the canal. Where did they come from? And more importantly, who knew how to do this? So you have Seth Tubbs, and Seth Tubbs was living in the Verona area, west of Rome. And he's repairing one of the state scows and is getting pitch and oakum and nails. The interesting thing is that Seth Tubbs, and maybe it's not a coincidence, his career was as a barrel maker. It is curious that his name is Tubbs. What is a boat but a big barrel? So I'm wondering if that's a clue. I mean, he would have had the corking tools and all that needed to work on watercraft. Okay, so I'm very familiar with this no vouchers remark. After 30 years of state service, I have a file cabinet of those still. It amazes me that every scrap of paper that went to the controller, everything had to be sent to the controller. That's the origin of the A1125 collection, is that it's what the state controller hung on to. They would go through, check for math. There were often a lot of math problems. Even Benjamin Wright, I was looking at his travel expenses. And it was not infrequent where the controller would nick him for a couple dollars because, well, you didn't get that guy to sign that receipt, so can't allow that. You're going to have to take that yourself. They're learning what to do. They're coming up with a system. Maybe it didn't work so well. So here, written in red, And these clarifications are always in red. To Marshall Lewis, and he was the section superintendent in Syracuse. And, you know, when you look at his accounts, he's doing a lot of work with a lot of people, but he gets one whole mess of stuff sent back to him by the controller with the remark, the great mass of these vouchers defective for want of specification of time or quantity or price, one or more of them. There is properly no evidence that the services and supplies have been performed or furnished. And the controller goes on for a whole page. I got statements like that. So state hasn't changed. Those accounts, though, again, if you dig deeper, list what people were getting paid. And obviously the 75 cents, as indicated here, is a very different 75 cents than what we have today. But what I'd be reaching for is the relative position of those payments to other occupations on the canal. So that the basic laborer got 75 cents a day. Where you have to be careful is sometimes it includes board, sometimes it doesn't. Benjamin Wright would get $4.80 a day. That's pretty good. A lock tender 70 cents a day, less than a laborer, but probably because the lock tender is getting bored, getting residents. He probably got bored too, but that's another story. Relative to some of the things that you would be buying at the time, so a shovel, based again on the A1125 records, a shovel cost $1. So it was more valuable than a man's labor for a day. If you think back to the beginning of the program, I think on DeWitt Clinton, do you remember the Madeira wine? So even I never attempted to submit vouchers for my beer tab when I was on the road. But here you have, again, this is Lansing, the section superintendent, purchasing substantial amounts of rum to keep the crew working for an emergency repair in 1823. There's a lot of discussion about alcohol in this early Republic period. Some historians kind of conclude that a lot of people must have been walking around daily in kind of a buzz. Here's another receipt to repair another emergency bank washout. But you have gin, you have whiskey, in fairly big quantities. Again, this is Lansing in Little Falls. And why it's anecdotally kind of interesting, it'd be more interesting if we could kind of put these pieces together, like how much for how many people. And there are a few cases where that was doable. So there was an emergency repair in Holly, New York in 1824. And over 1 week, the contractor bought 34 gallons of whiskey for a crew of 17 people. Yeah, maybe they shared stuff with neighbors, but 4.5 cups of whiskey a day, that seems quite a lot. A similar case near Durhamville, New York. This comes out to only 2.5 cups a person per day. So with that kind of ending, I'll just leave it there. And I saw there were several questions that were coming up. So David, can I turn it back to you?
Yeah, I'm gonna just take off the control of that. So my functions here. So there have been a few questions here, and actually I was gonna mention you're talking about the alcohol type and kind of even how that might almost relay to not just the quantity of people, but perhaps the background of those people. Maybe there's a shift in brandy to whiskey. But I also was going to make a point too before I get to some of the other questions here. That what I find interesting is by the enlarged era, there's actually in the contract that Otis Eddy had for the aqueduct at Schoharie Crossing, it specifies that he is not to supply his laborers with, quote, ardent spirits.
Oh, yes,
So I think
yes,
at some point they start to address this.
they do. They do. That's very much a part of the story. So, yes.
So we had a question come in. Stephen was asking in reference to the location of the original canal and its first shovel. So he says, so on the Holmes Hutchinson maps, the mark of the first excavation near the Erie Canal Village is wrong. The first shovel was near Rome.
Stephen, we can talk more about this. Again, that's Stephen Talbert, who's doing this great work on overlaying the historic maps to the current landscape. Yes, yes and no. The state marker by the Canal Village is again for the Richardson contract, which if you wanted to say, okay, that's contract one, section one, that was the very starting point for going west. So that's where they, in a sense, surveyed out and started. But two qualifiers for that. They didn't actually, Richardson didn't start work on that until well after Seymour had started his work on section two further west. So in a sense, the actual dirt work, the actual work of building the canal happened about a mile further west. And again, I think we have overlooked that because Seymour failed. And who wants to recognize that? I certainly do. But the ceremonial first digging, which was kind of a spur of the moment arrangement, was just down from the arsenal, the Rome arsenal, a building that still stands. So it was about near the junction of where and Stephen, I know you would know where this is, the western end of the Rome Canal tacked into the Clinton's Ditch. That's about where that first digging, ceremonial first digging occurred. Because the accounts discuss how the people of Rome went out to see the ceremonial first digging. They certainly didn't walk all the way out to where the canal village is today. The walk to the arsenal would have been, an easy thing. So, yeah, I hope that answers Steve's question. I think Frank Sadowski had a question. Hi, Frank.
Yeah, if are you looking at the one that just popped up there? If you remember things correctly, there was actually no first shovel. The first digging was by a team of oxen.
Oh, yeah, good point. Um, yes. Now the ceremonial was definitely a shovel because the accounts discuss how, and I should remember the names, so and so takes the first shovelful, then they pass it to another dignitary, then they pass the shovel to another dignitary. So everybody has a piece of the action. But yes, the very first digging, if you will, whether it's Seymour or Richardson, would have been with a scraper and an oxen. Yeah, you wouldn't have gotten started with a shovel. So yes, correct.
And I like the point you were making about Seymour and the fact that you can celebrate that failure because ultimately the canal itself was not a failure. And I think that, as an inspiration for a lot of us today, we need to have an understanding that just because a part of a project or a particular aspect of it is a failure doesn't mean that you can't overcome that. Not to lay so heavy a hand on the inspirational aspect of the Erie Canal, but I think that's something that um, there's a lot of folks, particularly school children, need to hear that message.
Oh yeah, and another sort of example of that, close to home, is Otis Eddy, who dies midway through building the Schoharie Aqueduct, correct?
I what I have come across is it was before it was in operation. It was apparently completed in 41, and he died in 43. Went to operation 45, and
Okay,
he was apparently a little bit late in actually fulfilling that contract, and that's part of the reason why the uh, family had to go on. His widow Harriet had to continue to petition for payment,
exactly.
just like you had
Exactly.
pointed out earlier with 10, 12 years later, people are still trying to get paid.
Right. And David, your point is very well taken. We look back on this period and it all worked. The canal for many people, and I wanted to say for many, not all people, was a tremendous success. At the time in 1817, indeed, the reason why they're just doing that easy middle section between Rome and the Seneca River, they weren't sure that it was going to work. And so if they could just get the connection between the Mohawk River and the Seneca River, okay, they would have had something. But if you had, put the microphone up to the guys at the ceremonial first digging and said, well, when you're going to get it completed, they would have put on a good face, but they didn't really know. And it wouldn't have surprised them if it didn't work. So, yeah, we take it for granted.
And as evidenced by those receipts, there was still a lot of dirty laundry along the canal.
Yes. And I don't understand canvas white. Maybe it's just a accident of history that those have survived, but he had a lot of laundry. So,
so there's a question coming in asking, or kind of parch my way through this one. Alcoholism was rampant at the time period for a variety of reasons. Water was dangerous, and the cholera epidemics. Irish immigrants escaping the horrors of the potato famine in Ireland. That would make anyone want to drink. Lacking antibiotics, people died regularly, children especially, poor sanitation, etc., leading to the rise in the temperance movement prior to women's rights movement and abolitionists. So those are really good, valid points about sort of that
absolutely,
the
absolutely,
change in the social aspects. Yeah, you have
and
additional
that
commentary
kind
on
of
that?
safe drink, with drinking water. That goes well into the 20th century where, I've seen ads for some of the breweries around Syracuse, 1910, before Prohibition, calling beer liquid bread. In an urban setting, yeah, beer was probably the safer alternative. So yes, absolutely. I'm not saying it was the healthy option, but yeah.
And Pam was asking what was done with the materials that were dug out. So they're digging the canal. What's going on with the rock or the mud, the muck, the dirt?
Oh, good question. Yes. So part of that goes into building for much of the canal, especially in that middle section. It's what's called a contour canal, where they were still kind of figuring out how to do this. They build the canal along the hillside, and that way, and remember, from Rome to the Seneca River, you're basically following the base of an escarpment. If you use the hillside as one side, you only have to build half a canal. And so the excavated stuff becomes the embankment for the towpath. It's certainly more of a problem when you get to Lockport. And you may have seen in the drawings that I showed earlier, there are these huge mounds of rock. Yeah, and some of those mounds of rock are still there. So yeah, it was a problem.
Yes, recycling isn't kind of along the lines of when parts of the canal abandoned that stone.
Yeah, I'm losing you, David.
Oh, I might have dropped. So Sandy's making a point that whiskey also provides a concentration of calorie intake for the workers. We might need a nutritionist to kind of give us the numbers on that one. There was a question from Andy earlier that came through. He's planning to ride his motorcycle from east to west from Rochester, visiting historic canal locations. What are the best resources to plan that trip and see some cool spots?
So run that by me again, east to west.
From Rochester.
So he's heading toward Buffalo.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, basically just stay along the Barge Canal. Sadly, I don't think you can put a motorcycle on the bike trail, but all those communities, Brockport, Albion, Medina, there's a lot of the architecture in those villages, and certainly Lockport. Yeah, Lockport would be my number one choice. Medina would be my number one choice. So I have a hard time making those decisions. But yeah, just visit those villages and you can clearly see the 19th century architecture. As far as particular structures, yeah, Medina has the only aqueduct on the barge canal. It's an impressive sight. At Lockport, you can still see the one tier of locks from the enlarged Erie Canal, some of which have been restored with wooden gates. It's spectacular. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. So,
And I was going to make a point. Hopefully, I'm still coming through okay. The keeping it in
yes,
the family part, I really kind of liked because that reminded me of the dam at Schoharie Crossing across the Schoharie Creek. That was Colonel John Littlejohn who builds that,
yes.
and then um, Abraham Newkirk winds up taking over the responsibilities of the ferry and the lock there within about a year or so. And it happens to be that Littlejohn married a Newkirk, so
Oh,
um, it's good to keep things in the family and be prosperous, I suppose. Uh,
right. It was a time, it was a difficult, well, difficult isn't the right word. Um, there was certainly social bubbling, if you will, and trying to come up with a way of working in an environment where everybody is a stranger. Remember, many, even if you're coming from New England, you're coming from a place where families had been living side by side for generations. Now you're in Rochester, New York, where there's no such social knitting, and so you're reaching for whatever could help tie people together. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but it's not a coincidence that you get the kind of second great awakening through this area as people are reaching for a firmer social bedrock, if you will. Um, that's one way to do it. The Masonic efforts at that time and the anti-Masonic efforts at that time are also kind of links in that society chain. So, yeah.
Very good. I love you made that point. That's a pretty good segue into. I was going to mention there's a lot of those kind of topics covered in Jack Kelly's Heaven's Ditch, God, Gold, and Murder
Oh,
on the Erie
absolutely.
Canal
Yep.
book,
Mhm.
which leads to Rich's question about any recommendations for best general history of the Erie Canal in book form.
Oh, yeah. Again, I highly recommend Patrick McGreevy's book. Though he specializes, I mean, he focuses in just on Lockport. Excuse me. The other classic histories for that early period of the canal, there are two. Carol Sheriff's Artificial River, um, still available. Um, Carol spent a lot of time at the state archives. The book is actually coming from her doctoral dissertation. Very, very good study. Um, and Ronald Shaw's Erie Water West. Um, Sadly, he's passed away. I knew him, um, but that's also still around, and probably gives the best kind of technological overview and political overview. Carroll's is more of a social history, but both definitely read both of them. So if you want to go beyond, you know, an easy read, there's always Noble Whitford's History of the Canal System.
That's the Erie Canal
Um,
Bible.
I, it's hundreds of pages long, but yeah, I would start with uh, Ronald Shaw's and Carroll's book. Mhm.
Stephen is asking the RPI is often mentioned as the first engineering school. Do any of the people that you've mentioned have direct connections to RPI?
Ah, um, none of the ones I've mentioned, but it's great that you mentioned that RPI connection because um, the Canal Society is working right now on a project dealing with Amos Eaton, who, if you're familiar with RPI, he's instrumental in its founding. And we're focusing in on Eaton's famous for many things. For canals, he's very famous for leading study tours across the new Erie Canal. He would take his students, he'd rent packet boat and take them from Troy to Buffalo to study the geology along the way. So you have a place like Gasport, New York. The reason it's called Gasport, New York is that the students found a bubbling springs nearby, and on their own they said, we're going to call this place Gasport, and the name stuck. One of the trips that we're really honing in on is the 1826 trip, where the students kept journals, and a number of those have survived. So Joseph Henry, who later becomes kind of a founder of the Smithsonian Institution, his journal is remarkable as they're taking a packet boat from Troy to Buffalo. Asa Fitch, who becomes the state's first entomologist, his is a really chatty, really neat document talking about people along the canal. George Clinton, DeWitt Clinton's nephew, was also one of the students. So all these journals, all related to RPI, getting back to RPI. Certainly later in the 19th century, RPI and Union College, they're the dominant forces. I can remember going to the canal office back in the 60s, and one of the defining characteristics was, did you go to Union College or did you go to RPI?
So I really like that you had made the comment too about the sort of it being the mirror of society, people of the state are operating it. And I'm glad that you're using these documents to tell the story. It's a very diverse story. And although there might be some flat earthers out there that would deny that those records are real and that canal was built the way that, reasonable people would believe it to be built, again, I truly appreciate that diversity equals success within your narrative here. Another great lesson that I think we can all take away from this program, and hopefully continue in sharing with the preservation and the telling the story of the Erie Canal to as many people that will listen, because it really does connect to everybody. You made a good point there as well.
It's so true, David. And you've heard me talk about David Vaughan and the fact that if you had gone into the canal offices in the 1850s, more than 75% of the professional staff working there would have been recent immigrants from Europe, maybe kind of refugees from the revolutions of 1848, German military officers, David Vaughan from Ireland. But also the technology, a lot of it is carbon copy from Europe. So yeah, we praise the Lockport locks, but there's a similar set of locks in Europe that they're based on. So it's not like we were inventing this from whole cloth. The same holds true to the 20th century, the barge canal. So we've all seen those movable dams in the Mohawk River. Those again are basically carbon copies of what you would see on the Moldau River in Europe. So they actually sent state people over there to study those dams, and we kind of lifted that technology and brought it home. I'm sure there are other people who can talk about the movable dams. I think I saw Mike Riley there. Yeah.
Shameless plug for Mike Riley and the American Canal Society. His book, you can check them out, find them online.
Another great source, and I should have said this earlier, I saw Frank Sadowski there. Yes. I can't say enough about Frank's website. That's usually the first place I refer people to. So Frank, you've done a great service to canal history. So I'm grateful for that. I know we're working on stuff, so thank you.
ErieCanal.org. That's up in the chat. I'll put that in on the YouTube as well, with several of these other links for folks to check out.
I saw Howard's name there too. So yeah.
Since we're bumping into just a few minutes past the hour mark, I think I'll reserve the final comments, and then for your closing, if you want to comment after mine. But I really do appreciate everybody tuning in this evening, and you, sir, I greatly appreciate your time and energies toward everything that you've done for the last however many years, as well as, if nothing else, just this hour of fantastic presentation. I'm truly grateful for it.
Oh,
everybody from Schoharie Crossing thanks you very, very much.
oh, thanks. And Schoharie Crossing always means a lot to us in the Canal Society. Um, we had started working on what becomes your park, your historic site back in the 1950s. We had pictures of our group leading Nelson Rockefeller around the locks at Schoharie Crossing. So yes, Schoharie Crossing next to Port Byron. I encourage everybody to come out to Port Byron. We open up on May 1st. You know, I am always referring people to Schoharie Crossing.
Great. And
I,
it's
I
it's
would
a
I would say that I actually visited there on my honeymoon. So there you go.
and as we talked about, that still has worked out very well. So that's even better. And I know Hal is joined in on this evening, and there are some wonderful pictures of Hal's son and at the time the to-be daughter-in-law over at the Canal store. Some wonderful engagement photos and a long, prosperous, healthy to them as well. And it's a shameless shout out to Hal and his family as well. Uh, but this has been fantastic, and
Good. Thanks, David.
thank you all so very much. Take care and be well. We'll see you again soon.
Be safe. Thanks.